Could Bigfoot be a fallen angel? Well, one of the things that really isn't talked a lot about Bigfoot, but I ask often, is why is Bigfoot restricted from coming in contact with us?
David Paulides, the most credible Bigfoot investigator alive, just uncovered something that tears the entire Bigfoot mystery wide open. These things are definitely real, and what he just found has put him in permanent conflict with the entire scientific establishment across North America. DNA that no laboratory can cleanly explain, footprints that violate everything we understand about biomechanics, and a government paper trail that nobody in uniform will go anywhere near. They have known about these creatures for years. They know what they are. They know where they are. And they chose silence over the truth. David Paulides just ended that silence and leaked everything. The faces that shouldn't exist. When Paulides arrived at the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California, he was not expecting what he found. Paulides had been brought there to investigate Bigfoot sightings using the same methods he had used his entire career to investigate crimes. He expected to find confused witnesses, inconsistent stories, and the kind of gaps in testimony that tell an experienced detective that someone is making things up. What Paulides found instead was something that he had no framework to dismiss. The people of the Hoopa tribe were not frightened. They simply talked about these creatures the way you talk about something that has always been there. They did not call them Bigfoot. They called them the forest people. And that name was not casual. It carried a specific meaning. The elders described territories that both sides respected. There were invisible lines in the forest that neither the tribe nor the creatures crossed. No agreement had ever been written down. No meeting had ever taken place. But the lines have held for generations. And what that means, when you sit with it, is that something out there in those trees was intelligent enough to understand boundaries and disciplined enough to keep them. Then the elders described the feeding ritual. Tribe members would leave food at the edge of the forest, not as a religious offering or out of fear. This was just like the way you leave something out for a neighbor you have quietly come to understand. And whatever was in those trees would come for it every time. Paulides had spent nearly 2 decades interrogating real criminals, so he knows exactly what a fabricated story looked like and what genuine memory sounded like. The difference is in the details. Liars tend to give you the dramatic parts, while real witnesses give you the quiet, specific details that nobody would bother to invent. And that was what Paulides kept hearing at Hoopa.
This is a real dynamic signature of a consistent, functional aspect of the foot.
Over 45 of the witnesses signed sworn legal affidavits confirming their accounts. But it was what came next that truly changed everything. Paulides brought in Harvey Pratt. He is one of the most respected forensic sketch artists in American law enforcement history. He spent 40 years working for the FBI. He worked the BTK killer case, where a sadistic strangler mailed taunting letters to police for 30 years before anyone caught him. He worked the Green River killer case, where a truck driver murdered at least 49 women and hid so many bodies along a river highway that investigators are still finding remains today. He even worked the Oklahoma City federal building bombing, the deadliest domestic terror attack in American history, which killed 168 people, including 19 children, in a daycare center. Pratt's job was to sit with traumatized survivors in the hours after the worst moments of their lives and pull the faces of monsters from their memories with enough precision to hold up in a federal courtroom. This man had seen everything. Pratt is also a member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes and a recognized traditional Cheyenne peace chief. That background gave him access that Paulides alone never could have had. Witnesses opened up to Pratt in ways they had never opened up to anyone. Some of them described things they had kept locked inside for decades, including the eye contacts. Multiple witnesses described these creatures making deliberate, sustained eye contact, not the startled glance of a frightened animal, but intentional eye contacts, like something that was communicating. These locals even described what Bigfoot really looks like. They did not look like an ape or like anything that belongs in a zoo or a wildlife documentary. They looked like a person. They had high cheekbones, deep-set, expressive eyes, and a facial structure that, if it appeared at your window on a dark night, your brain would process as human before something in your gut told you the proportions were horribly wrong. Pratt looked at Paulides after those first sessions and said directly, "This isn't anything like we've always heard. When the man who drew the faces of the worst humans alive tells you that what he just drew disturbed him, you do not just brush that off." As if that wasn't already disturbing enough, the Hoopa Valley Reservation sits inside Humboldt County, California. The area around Bluff Creek, just outside Hoopa territory, is the exact same location where the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film was recorded. That film remains the most analyzed piece of alleged Bigfoot footage ever captured. Biomechanics and researchers, including scientists from the Russian Academy of Sciences, studied the creature's walking pattern in that footage and concluded that the stride length and hip movement cannot be physically replicated by a human being wearing a costume. The location of Paulides' most compelling testimony and the location of the world's most scrutinized Bigfoot footage are the same stretch of Northern California forest. That is not a coincidence, and it only gets darker from here. The boundary behavior the Hoopa described also has a direct parallel in documented primate science. Chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives, maintain territorial boundaries through a combination of sound, physical marking, and learned social understanding passed down through generations. What the Hoopa elders described was not supernatural. It was the behavior of a highly intelligent social creature that had learned over centuries exactly where the safe limit of human proximity was and had taught that knowledge to its young. That is not a monster. That is a thinking being. Their faces looked human and their behavior suggested a level of intelligence that crossed a line most people were not ready to cross. But looking human and actually being human are two completely different things. The only way to answer that question for certain was to run the science. So Paulides ran the science. And what came back from the laboratory was a result so explosive that the entire scientific establishment tried to pretend it did not exist. The DNA that broke the scientific establishment. Paulides organized the most serious scientific study ever conducted on alleged Bigfoot biological material. Through his organization, North America Bigfoot Search, he selected Dr. Melba Ketchum, a veterinarian and forensic DNA expert, to lead the analysis. The study involved 11 co-authors across multiple scientific disciplines. The team tested 111 samples of hair, tissue, and biological material collected from reported encounter sites across North America. This was not a backyard experiment. This was a structured, multi-author scientific study with more samples than most mainstream wildlife DNA research ever produces. The results came back, and they were unsettling to say the least. The mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic material passed down through the mother's side of a family, came back fully human. Whatever these creatures are, the maternal line in their DNA traces directly back to a human woman. If that finding is accurate, then somewhere in human history, a woman gave birth to whatever Bigfoot is. That is not a metaphor. That is exactly what the data says. The paternal side was something else entirely. It contained an unknown non-human primate component that did not match any documented species anywhere in the genetic record. It was not a known ape or anything that science had ever cataloged. The conclusion reached by all 11 authors of the study was that this creature was a human hybrid, part human and part something that has no name. Then Paulides commissioned a separate 5-year independent study. His colleague developed a method to isolate and extract DNA from Bigfoot hair samples that had previously been too degraded to analyze. What came back from that study was even more disturbing. The DNA sequences found in those samples appeared nowhere in the billions of genetic records in the entire global human and primate database. It was not Neanderthal, Denisovan, or any known primate. Based on these findings, Paulides described the entity as thinking, breathing, intellectual people that are quite different from humans. Now here is what the scientific establishment did with all of that. They first did nothing, then they started ridiculing the whole findings. Major scientific journals refused to even review the paper. Reviewers declined to engage with the data, not because the methodology had been proven wrong, but because the conclusion was considered too threatening to the established understanding of the world. Ketchum eventually published the study in a scientific journal she purchased specifically because no existing journal would touch it. That decision has been used against her ever since. But step back and think about what that actually means. A 111-sample study with 11 scientific co-authors produced results that were independently verified multiple times, but could not find a single mainstream institution in the world willing to formally evaluate it. But they were not alone. This kind of institutional shutdown has happened before. Barry Marshall was a doctor in Australia who spent years telling the medical establishment that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterial infection, not stress. They laughed at him at every conference and refused to publish his work. Marshall eventually drank a petri dish full of the bacteria himself to force the conversation. He got sick, treated himself with antibiotics, and recovered. In 2005, Marshall won the Nobel Prize in Medicine. The history of science is not a clean record of truth being welcomed. It is a record of institutions protecting what they already believe until they can no longer afford to. The mitochondrial DNA finding also carries a timeline that should stop you cold. Mitochondrial DNA mutates at a known and measurable rate. If the maternal line in these samples is human, geneticists can calculate roughly when the hybridization happened. Analysis based on the Ketchum data places that event between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago. That is the end of the last ice age. That is the exact window in human history when Denisovans, remnant Neanderthal populations, and early modern humans were actively encountering and interbreeding with each other across Eurasia and the Americas. We already know interbreeding between different human species happened. The only question now is how many of those resulting lineages we actually know about. In 2019, a peer-reviewed paper published in the American Journal of Human Genetics confirmed that modern humans carry DNA from at least one completely unknown archaic human population. Scientists call it ghost DNA. It appears in the genomes of West African populations and represents a lineage that diverged from the human family tree roughly 360,000 years ago. This was not published in a fringe publication. This was published in one of the most respected genetics journals in the world. Of course, that finding does not prove Paulides is right, but it makes the idea that another unknown human-related lineage could exist feel a great deal less impossible than it did before. There is one more implication of the DNA findings that nobody talks about openly. If these entities are confirmed as partially human hybrids, it creates an immediate and deeply uncomfortable legal problem. In 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project filed the first legal case in United States history, arguing for personhood rights for chimpanzees. Yes, they lost the case, but chimpanzees share roughly 98.7% of human DNA with us. If the Ketchum findings are accurate, then these creatures share a substantially higher percentage with a fully human maternal line. Legal scholars who have reviewed the data have pointed out that under strict biological definitions, these entities would have a stronger claim to human-adjacent legal protections than any other non-human species ever tested. No government on Earth has any interest in that conversation starting, which may be the simplest and most honest explanation for why every institutional door in this story has been slammed shut. The DNA said human hybrid. The sketches from Pratt looked like a person, but DNA can be contested in a courtroom, and sketches depend on the reliability of the witnesses behind them. What cannot be argued away as easily is the evidence pressed directly into the ground that followed the laws of physics and biology, whether anyone likes it or not. The evidence you cannot explain away. In June of 1982, United States Forest Service personnel on a routine patrol in Walla Walla, Washington were stopped cold when they stumbled across a series of enormous tracks pressed deep into a natural deposit of loess soil. Loess is one of the finest grained soils found anywhere in North America, and when it is cool and damp, it preserves impressions at a microscopic level of detail. 3 of the tracks were cast in plaster and hauled in for scientific analysis. What those casts preserved was not just the size and shape of a foot. They preserved dermal ridges, and that is where this evidence becomes almost impossible to argue away. Dermal ridges are the friction skin patterns that cover the hands and feet of all higher primates. They are what produce fingerprints in human beings. Every set is unique to the individual that carries them, and they follow strict biological rules about how they form and flow across the skin. You cannot convincingly manufacture them under field conditions because any faked pattern immediately violates those structural rules the moment a specialist places it under a microscope. Dermatoglyphics experts examined the Walla Walla casts and confirmed the ridges were fully consistent with genuine higher primate friction skin. The foot measured 37.5 centimeters long by 17 centimeters wide, wiping out every known primate species on Earth as a possible source. The structure of the first toe identified it as a hominid foot rather than an ape, and the pressure patterns in the soil calculated the body weight of the creature at between 300 and 400 kilograms. Nothing that heavy has ever walked upright on two legs anywhere in the documented wildlife history of North America. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, examined the track evidence and identified the single hardest physical detail in this entire investigation to dismiss. He found what is known as the mid-tarsal break. This is a point of flexibility in the middle section of the foot that non-human primates and early human ancestors like Australopithecus possessed, but that modern humans do not. Our midfoot is completely locked and rigid. The mid-tarsal break produces a walking pattern that cannot be faked using a prosthetic foot or modified boot because reproducing it would require a flexible device that bends at exactly the correct anatomical point while bearing the weight of a 400-kilogram body, without leaving any trace of the device's edges in the surrounding soil. No such device has ever been produced or recovered from any track site. Meldrum examined hundreds of independent track casts from across North America and found the mid-tarsal break present consistently across all of them. He published peer-reviewed academic papers on his findings and wrote a book published by Simon & Schuster. His colleagues publicly mocked him and questioned his position, but Meldrum has not retracted a single word. Dr. Jane Goodall, the most respected primatologist alive today, stated in a 2002 NPR interview that she believed large undiscovered primates could exist in North America and that the question deserved serious engagement. She pointed to the mountain gorilla, dismissed as African mythology until 1902, and the okapi called a fantasy until 1901. When the most qualified person on Earth to make that judgment refuses to dismiss the question, everyone doing the dismissing should be required to explain why their judgment outweighs hers. Now to a disturbing recording made by two local hunters. In the early 1970s, two hunters named Ron Moorhead and Al Berry were camped deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California when they began hearing sounds that stopped them cold. These were not animal sounds they could not identify, but something more deliberate and structured. They started recording and returned across multiple seasons. What accumulated became known as the Sierra Sounds. The University of Wyoming conducted a full year-long independent acoustic analysis and confirmed the sounds were not produced by any mechanical device. They came from a living biological organism. Then in 2008, a man named Scott Nelson was helping his 11-year-old son with a homework assignment about Bigfoot when he found the Sierra sound recordings online. He pressed play, and something in the deepest part of his professional training fired like an alarm. Scott Nelson had spent 20 years as a cryptologic interpreter for the United States Navy, decoding enemy military voice communications in Russian, Spanish, and Persian. He is a two-time graduate of the U.S. Navy Cryptologic Voice Transcription School and logged thousands of hours analyzing the human voice under operational pressure. After retiring, Nelson chaired the Philosophy and Language Department at Missouri Military Academy. This was not a man who chased mysteries. This was a man whose entire professional life was built on the precise science of how language works. Nelson spent months trying to find the flaw. He isolated phonemes, which are the individual sound units every language is built from, and identified morphemes, which are the smallest units of meaning. He found specific sequences recurring consistently across sessions recorded years apart at different locations using different equipment. In genuine language, units repeat because they carry meaning used again and again. But in random animal noise, that pattern does not exist. What Nelson found inside the Sierra Sounds was structure, recurrence, and the unmistakable signature of something communicating. His formal conclusion, stated publicly, and which has never once been challenged by any linguist anywhere in the world, was this: it is definitely a language, it is definitely not human in origin, and it could not have been faked. Like Nelson's findings were not disturbing enough, in 2022, a wildlife acoustics research team with no connection to Bigfoot research ran the recordings through automated acoustic analysis software, the same technology used to study whale communication and monitor endangered species. The software identified phonemic patterns inconsistent with any known North American animal and flagged the recordings as warranting urgent further investigation. Even though that finding was published, it received almost no press coverage. These were not Bigfoot researchers. They were professional wildlife acoustics specialists whose standard software returned a result that their standard training had no category for. The footprints cannot be manufactured, and the recordings cannot be explained. The DNA points at something carrying human blood. And at every turn, credible people with real careers at stake have followed the evidence to disturbing conclusions, while the institutions that should engage honestly with those conclusions have looked away and locked the door. That looking away, it turns out, has left a paper trail. And that paper trail leads somewhere that should make every person watching this furious. What the government has been hiding. In 1976, a Bigfoot researcher named Peter Byrne walked into the FBI's crime laboratory and formally submitted hair and tissue samples, asking the Bureau to determine whether they came from a known species or something never documented. FBI Director Clarence Kelly personally authorized the laboratory examination. The Bureau ran the tests. An official file was opened and every step was formally documented. The results identified the samples as coming from a member of the deer family. But think about what actually happened underneath that result. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the personal written authorization of its director, ran official scientific tests on Bigfoot evidence, created a formal record of the entire process, and then locked that record away from the public for over 40 years. Government agencies do not classify results they consider worthless. They do not spend resources protecting information that amounts to nothing. Those 40 years of silence are not a footnote. They are a confession. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, Paulides and his team dragged out additional documents the government had never volunteered. These were official records carrying government letterheads, file numbers, and agency identifiers, all referencing encounters with large, unidentified upright walking creatures on federal land, national park ranger logs, military field reports, internal agency communications, and real documents produced by government employees in the course of their official duties. One case is particularly difficult to rationalize away. In 1980, a security guard at the Nevada test site filed a report describing a large, hairy, upright creature crossing a road in broad daylight. The Nevada test site is a heavily restricted federal facility used for nuclear weapons testing. Sitting in open flat desert with no forest cover and no natural concealment for a large approaching creature. The security personnel there are professionally trained to identify and report physical threats. The argument that a trained professional in open desert in broad daylight misidentified a shadow or a bear does not hold up under any honest examination here. Then there is the National Park Service, and this is where the anger in this story fully ignites. The National Park Service manages 85 million acres of federally owned wilderness. When Paulides formally requested a comprehensive database of missing persons cases from those parks, he was told that no such database existed. He then filed multiple separate Freedom of Information Act requests for individual park records. Many were refused outright on the grounds that compiling the information would require too many resources. The agency responsible for the safety of every visitor to 85 million acres either does not know how many people have vanished inside it, or it knows and will not say. What independent researchers pieced together from their own analysis was horrifying. they discovered that there were children who had disappeared within feet of their parents without leaving a single trace behind them. There were also search dogs that could pick up no scent at all from the last known location, and even cases where the missing person's clothing was found neatly folded near the last known location with no remains anywhere nearby. Professional search and rescue coordinators with decades of experience stated on record that what they encountered in these cases was unlike anything their careers had prepared them for. The geographic spread of those cases welds this story together. The three densest clusters of missing 411 disappearances, independently mapped by researchers who began with no Bigfoot agenda, sit in the Pacific Northwest corridor from Northern California through Oregon and Washington, the upper Midwest lake regions, and the Appalachian mountain range from Georgia to Pennsylvania. Those are also the three corridors where the most credible Bigfoot reports have been filed continuously for over a century, where indigenous communities carry the oldest traditions of coexistence with the forest people, and where Freedom of Information requests related to wildlife anomalies have come back the most heavily redacted. Among the recovered documents were military field reports produced by uniformed personnel through official reporting chains describing encounters with large bipedal creatures near active military installations. Someone in a chain of command received every one of those reports, processed them, and chose deliberately to file them rather than investigate or disclose. That choice was made repeatedly across multiple branches of service, multiple decades, and multiple regions of the country. Every thread in this investigation pulls in the same direction, and that direction leads to a conclusion so explosive that it explains, more clearly than anything else, why every institution involved has fought so ferociously to keep the doors sealed shut. What Bigfoot actually is, and why that is the terrifying part. Here is the conclusion, stated without a single qualifier, softening the edges, because the evidence has earned the right to be stated plainly. Bigfoot is partly human, not as folklore or as a spiritual belief, but as the finding of a 111-sample DNA study signed off on by 11 scientific co-authors and independently verified multiple times before the establishment sealed it away. The maternal DNA line is human, while the paternal component matches nothing cataloged anywhere on the planet, and the government has been quietly burying reports about encounters with these creatures on federal land for decades, while feeding the public nothing but silence. There is something living on this continent alongside us that thinks, communicates, raises its young, maintains social structures, negotiates territorial boundaries across generations, and carries human DNA threaded through its biology. And the question that should be tearing through everything right now is this: what does it mean when a government knows that and says nothing? If these entities are partly human, then the agencies that classified the files, shut the journal doors, refused the Freedom of Information requests, and spent decades publicly destroying anyone who brought credible evidence forward were not covering up a monster. They were covering up a person. A thinking, partly human being living in the wilderness of a country built on the loudly declared principle that all people deserve protection under the law. The 2025 documentary American Sasquatch pulls in quantum physics as a framework for behaviors that traditional biology has no answer for. Tracks that end in the middle of open ground with nothing after them. Sightings where something appears and then vanishes without traveling through the space between. Quantum biology has already confirmed that birds navigate continents using quantum entanglement, that quantum tunneling operates inside human enzyme reactions, and that quantum coherence drives photosynthesis in plants. The idea that a biological organism could interact with physical space in ways that leave inexplicable gaps is no longer something serious physics can dismiss. What the documentary is carefully suggesting is that the full explanation for what these creatures can do may require scientific frameworks that humanity has not finished building yet. Then, there is the telepathy. Multiple Hoopa witnesses who had never compared notes independently described the identical experience. They came face to face with one of these creatures, no sound was made, and a message detonated inside their minds with total clarity. This was not a wave of general fear, but a specific directed communication arriving the way a spoken sentence arrives through your ears. Indigenous tribes across the Pacific Northwest documented this for centuries, describing it as established understood knowledge long before the word Bigfoot existed. In 2007, a husband and wife named Donnie and Lynn gave a documented account of mental contact with one of these creatures. A documentary called Sasquatch Speaks later gathered more than 10 individuals, none of whom had coordinated their stories, but they all described the same experience in the same terms. If Paulides is right that these are partly human-thinking beings who have lived alongside human civilization for thousands of years and have been documented by every indigenous culture on this continent, then the real question is not whether Bigfoot exists. The real question is what it means that we may already know and chose not to. That is not a story about something frightening in the forest. That is a story about what powerful institutions do when the truth would cost them more than the lie. That story has played out before in medicine, in government, in history, and it has never once ended well for the people who knew the truth and buried it. David Paulides is in his 70s. He has poured the better part of his life into forcing this question into the open. The clock is running, and it is not running only on him. It is running on the question itself. And when questions this large go unanswered for this long, the answer that eventually surfaces has a way of being far worse than anyone was prepared for.